Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics Indo-Pacific Roundtable 2024. This is actually our fourth iteration of the Roundtable. The very first was in December 2021. We had 14 invited guests around a conference room table. We were still just coming out of lockdown. There were no public panels or sessions, and the furthest anyone came from to attend that was London, right? And so then we had another one in spring of 2022, and then we've kept with the spring calendar since then in 2023, 2024. The second roundtable had one public panel the evening before a day of closed panels. The third one last year had 3 public panels. This year, we have 5 public panels. Our first one, if you recall, had 14 invited guests. This time we have more than 40. We also, for the first time, have invitees and attendees from at least 7 different countries beyond the UK, across Europe, Asia, and North America. With all of this growth, we are now, I'm pretty confident in saying, the largest gathering in Europe focused on politics and international relations across the whole of the Indo-Pacific. And we have ambition even to grow from this. So in less than 4 years, we've gone from nothing to the largest such venue in Europe. So that's due to the hard work of everyone in the center, but also the willingness of people to come and attend and present and engage with one another and with the broader audience. So thank you everyone for coming. I look forward very much to a good set of discussions over the next 2 days. And with that, let's get started with our first panel, which will be on security across the Indo-Pacific, and which will be chaired by my colleague, Professor John Nilsson-Wright, from Cambridge Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and also the Center for Geopolitics. So, John, if you want to kick off the first panel.
So, first of all, thank you to Bill. Where is Bill? Thank you, Bill, for making all of this possible. It's a really great pleasure to see you all. As Bill mentioned, I teach at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm also the head of the Japan and Korea's program that we recently established here at the Center for Geopolitics. And it's my real pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to chair our first panel, which is obviously focusing on the question of security, broadly defined. It probably needs no reminding that we are living in very uncertain times at the moment. And some of the challenges that we are facing are structural. Just to sort of highlight some of the critical issues, we have a nuclear North Korea, which is continuing to act as a source of uncertainty, if not provocation, in the region. China's expanding military expenditure is a predominant concern for countries in the region and further afield, of course. Territorial conflicts, whether in the East China Sea or in the South China Seas, remain a principal concern for many countries. And perhaps most importantly of all, in terms of the broader political dynamics, the so-called tension between liberal democracy and authoritarian regimes. We saw recently, of course, the summit meeting between Xi Jinping and President Putin, leaders who've met, I think, no fewer now than 40 times, underscoring, I think, the strength of resolve on the part of these two leaders to work increasingly closely together to challenge existing notions of order. And of course, in this year, with so many elections taking place around the world, and of course, as we learned just a few days ago in the UK, this is a time of acute political change and uncertainty. Domestically, the emergence of populist parties and the growing swing to more extremist versions of politics is a source of concern. And perhaps one election above all is raising real concerns in the Indo-Pacific, which of course, looking ahead to November, and certainly based on the polls, the prospect of Donald Trump taking over as the US president in November. Of course, politics is a difficult business, particularly when you're engaging in the art of forecasting or prediction, so I won't make any pronouncements, but I know certainly when you look at the activity of leaders in the Indo-Pacific, trying to prepare for that eventuality is raising very legitimate concerns. Our discussion, of course, will not only focus on countries in the region, but I'm sure we'll want to discuss the role of European actors, European countries. Britain, of course, since 2021 has defined itself very explicitly as an Indo-Pacific power as a result of the integrated review, and then in 2023 the integrated review refresh. But with security concerns closer to home in Europe, and obviously the war in Ukraine dominating a lot of our defence and security planning, there are real questions about the capacity of European states to remain engaged in the Indo-Pacific region. And beyond those big structural questions, as we've seen just recently in the last few days, China's decision to carry out military drills to, in the words of multiple reports, to punish Taiwan, a reaction to the new president, President Lai, is a source of real anxiety. Questions of regional internal stability. We saw President Macron unexpectedly fly across the world to New Caledonia to deal with what has been characterized as an imminent civil war in a French dependency. Highlights, I think, again, the importance of thinking about Europe's connections with the region. It is, I'd just like to strike an optimistic note, not all doom and gloom, despite all of those security concerns. Countries in the region are meeting. Looking ahead to the end of this month, we will see for the first time in 4.5 years a trilateral summit between China, Japan and South Korea. And one hopes that that level of coordination and discussion will provide a basis for reassurance and stabilization. So just by way of giving you a sense of some of the issues, I think that will hopefully set the scene for some of our discussion. Let me introduce very briefly our panellists in the order in which they will be speaking. To the far right of the panel, from my perspective, Dr. Che-Chuan Lee, who's a research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research in Taiwan. And as you'll see from the program, his specializations focus on China-Taiwan relations, cross-strait relations, and regional security. Welcome, Dr. Lee. And then next to him, also from Taiwan, Professor Hans Tung, Professor of Political Science at National Taiwan University. Very much interested in political and economic dynamics, particularly in the context of authoritarian politics, which I think will open up, a lot of space for us to talk about this new axis of authoritarian regimes that we're seeing emerging with such determination at the moment. Next to him, my old friend, Professor Seong-Ho Sheen, who I've known for many years, since my time teaching at Seoul National University. It's wonderful to see you again. Professor Sheen is a Professor of International Security at the Graduate Institute at Seoul National University. His specialties include US-ROK relations and wider regional security issues, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot to reflect on when we talk about the role of Korea and other countries. And then last but not least, Professor Astrid Nordin, the Lau Chair of Chinese International Relations at King's College, London. You focus on China's international relations from multiple perspectives, security, economic, and also perhaps worth mentioning that you are, I think, also an associate fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. And as somebody who was born in Stockholm to a Swedish mother, I'm delighted to have another Swede on the panel. So welcome to you all. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, I've asked each of the panelists to reflect for about 10 minutes on some of those key issues. We're going to have a series of presentations, and then I'm going to move to a discussion amongst the members of the panel, and then we will open up to further Q&A from you, the audience, and I would like to encourage you to raise as many questions as you can, because we want to make this as interactive as possible. So, with no further ado, let me turn to our first presenter to open our discussion.
Thank you, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Che-Chuan from INDSR, a think tank inaugurated 6 years ago, focusing on Taiwan's national security and national defense. I'm currently a research fellow. So as a think tank researcher, I will focus on my presentation here today on current situation in the Taiwan Strait area. First of all, I would like to convey my sincerest gratitude to Cambridge University Center for Geopolitics for their invitation, because without that, I won't have the opportunity sitting here today to share with you my personal observation and learning from your insights and comments. Because I prepared some figures. I cannot really remember, memorize them, so excuse me if I use my cell phone. We know Taiwan's geopolitical importance, economic strength, and technological advancement, and especially its very challenging defense situation. All these factors underscore the importance of Taiwan and the issue of Taiwan Strait security, not only conventional security, but also economic security for the global observers. So I would like to share with my personal observation 3 points here. The first one is that we witnessed that in the past 8 years under President Tsai Ing-wen, she just finished her terms days ago, that security situation in the Taiwan Strait has become increasingly challenging, but so far I would say that Taiwan has doing well, doing fine. And during the past 8 years, China has been trying to change the status quo or create a new normal in this region. There are at least several examples here for your reference. The first one is that it is clear that China has been crossing and denying the existence of the so-called median line in the Taiwan Strait, which was an informal tacit mutual understanding between the two sides. So that has become a new normal. So we have many warplanes from the PLA or naval vessels show up in waters and airspace around Taiwan. For instance, last year, we have 4,200 sorties from the PLA last year, including crossing the median line and intruding into Taiwan's ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone. And the second difference is that the PLA has been conducting the so-called Joint Combat Readiness Patrol in waters surrounding Taiwan. They conduct that kind of patrol every 7 to 10 days in average, and by dispatching 10 warplanes from the PLA and usually 3 to 4 naval vessels, trying to exhaust Taiwan's defense capacity and intimidate people on these islands. And that began in August 2022. The third point is that recently, China just denied the existence of the so-called prohibited water and restricted water around Kinmen. That was de facto, or essentially, actually, they are the territorial water and contiguous water set up by Taiwan in mid-1990s. And we had no problem previously, but they denied it in this February. And 2 days after that, Chinese Coast Guard began to conduct its so-called law enforcement regular patrol in waters surrounding Kinmen. So from these case examples, we can see that there has been some new normal or some change of status quo, but so far I think Taiwan has been able to push them back and to hold our line in the past 8 years. So what about the implication against Taiwan? I would say that the first one, which is important, that according to the long-term survey conducted by Taiwan's National Chengchi University, it reflects that there are there are about 33.2% of people on Taiwan. They prefer maintaining status quo indefinitely, meaning forever. These people would reject the idea of reunification with China or declaring Taiwan independence, which is the first time in Taiwan that this kind of position becomes the largest portion on our populations. And for those people prefer either declaring independence as soon as possible or later, I mean moderate, relatively moderate position that increased by around about 2.4%. And for those people who's agreeing with national reunification with mainland China sooner or later, or radically, those people account for only 7.4% last year. It decreased by 2.6%. So that is the change of people's attitude toward the so-called final resolution of the cross-strait disputes. And the second implication, I think it's also very impressive that the DPP, serving as the ruling party in the past 8 years, was able to win the third term of presidency in Taiwan, which never happened before. But I would say that at least the worst case scenario for China did not really happen because DPP lose the majority seat in Congress by 1 seat behind the KMT, which means current new president Lai in Taiwan, he has to face double pressures, not only from China, but also from the opposition party in Taiwan. My second observation to share is that China may not use force against Taiwan in the near future, but I would say that a de facto blockade or quarantine would deserve a serious global concern. Many experts would agree that the idea that Xi Jinping may be likely to use non-connected means trying to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, at least in the near future. And I would say that it is not only because Xi Jinping said that in last November. He said he has no plan to attack Taiwan, no matter in 2027 or 2035. And I would say it is more so because of the kind of extended deterrence capability composed of US and Taiwan's military preparedness, capabilities, and willingness has been strengthened so that the balance of power across the strait has been tilted back to some extent to the side of Taiwan. For instance, in Taiwan, in addition to continued procurement of conventional and asymmetric weapons from the United States, we continue to strengthen our local defense industry. We just launched our first indigenous defense submarine in this February, of course, with a lot of assistance from countries like United States, United Kingdom, South Korea, and some other democracies. And we have also finished delivery of 6 Navy corvettes. We call it Tuojiang class. And we also are going to finish to deliver 66 advanced jet fighter trainer plane by the end of 2026. And to enhance people's warfighting capability, professional and those conscription system, we are able to begin our conscription system to expand it from 4 months to 1 year, beginning from this January. And the training program for the reservists, which was pretty much falling behind, it was only 5 to 7 days every 2 years, but now it's 14 days every year for the retired, military person. And critical infrastructure resilience is another important issue. So in Taiwan, we not only have been working on our energy, cyber, telecommunication, transportation, banking, and the medical sectors, through rounds of wargaming discussion and real exercise, we have been strengthened their resilience. And the last but not the least is that we are able to launch so-called all-out defense program so that people's defense situation awareness and the technology, the knowledge and the skill they need to learn in war times could be, well enhanced. However, we know that Taiwan, as a series of bigger and smaller islands, is very vulnerable to the scenario like de facto lockdown. Blockade or quarantine. That is undeniable because the food storage or the energy inventory on the island is quite limited. But on the other hand, for Beijing, it is the cost of imposing blockade or quarantine is is much lower than fighting a war with Taiwan. Moreover, it is very kind of convenient for Beijing because a case of blockade could put Beijing in the driver's seat, under which it can decide the scale, the intensity, or the tempo of the quarantine. And it can also decide when to calibrate, de-escalate, or escalate the situation, depending on the response from Taipei and Washington. So I don't think we have to repeat the possible impact of a comprehensive blockade against Taiwan. There are so many estimates. For instance, the Institute of Economics and Peace, they say that if a Chinese blockade happened against Taiwan, it will lead to a drop of a global economic output at around US dollars 2.7 trillion, meaning 2.8% of global GDP. So that is an issue, I think it deserves our serious attention and concern. My third point is that I believe like-minded countries, especially democracy, can help each other enhance resilience against authoritarian coercion. There are many examples related with Taiwan. For instance, when German economic minister wrote a letter to his counterpart in Taiwan, asking Taiwan to help mitigate the German auto chips shortage because of the COVID-19 lockdown. We were able to finish the mission by our very capable semiconductor company like TSMC, UMC. And another example comes in 2020s when Australia suffered from economic coercion imposed by China. Since then, we purchased more products from Australia, like red wine, lobster, and it shows that the total export volume from Australia to Taiwan in 2022 increased 133% comparing to the figures in 2019. Therefore, Taiwan ranks #1 country in this region in Indo-Pacific. And what is also very important is that other countries in this region, including Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Japan, South Korea, their kind of procurement from Australia also increased by 100%. So that is a very good case for how democracies could help each other to enhance economic resilience. And the third example, I don't have to repeat that. We all know that Taiwan is playing a very critical role in semiconductor industry. And we not only join Chip 4 with countries like United States, Japan, South Korea, trying to enhance industrial resilience, supply chain resilience. Our company like TSMC, USC, or Power Chips, they all agreed to set a factory in countries like United States, Japan, and Germany, and Singapore and India. And from my personal opinion, I would say that on the other hand, like-minded country could help each other, and especially could help Taiwan by expressing their concerns on the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait areas. And we noticed that since 2021, a lot of democracies declaring their concerns over peace and stability in Taiwan Strait by joint statement and communiques. Not only that, since last February, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he said that the issue between Taiwan and China is not an internal issue of China. It is literally a matter of global concern. And after Blinken, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, they also expressed similar concern. So I think Taiwan is sitting on the juncture of first island chain defense and serving as a critical player in global supply chain resilience. Some even argue that Taiwan is the epicenter of US-China hegemonic competitions, and even at the play as the most critical decisive factor of the so-called Cold War 2.0, if there is one. So I think that is the reason why we are sitting here today. I'll stop there, and I look forward to learn from your insights, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Che-Chuan, thank you very much for setting the scene so expertly, and both in terms of thinking about those concrete potential scenarios for a conflict with China. The idea of a blockade, I think, raises all sorts of questions about how best to offset that risk, and I'm sure we'll want to come back and discuss that. And also reminding us that security is increasingly multifaceted when we think about the different ways in which we can define it in a world increasingly more integrated. So economic resilience as well as traditional security concerns, it's clearly a very important part of the discourse and debate. And also, very importantly, as you outlined, the question of domestic public opinion. I have questions, but I'm going to hold them and move on through the panel, and then we'll come back to discussion. But thank you very much. Hans, if I can ask you to go next, please.
Right. Thank you, John. Well, first, I would like to thank the Center for the invitation to attend this event. And also, I want to make a caveat that the view I'm going to share with you is only my own, and it's not representative of any affiliations I have currently. So I'm also going to share with you my personal assessment of the current situation across the Taiwan Strait. And I agree, of course, a lot of the points Dr. Lee just made. But I would like to start from a framework. So we think that now the question is all about status quo. And there are a couple of different actors involved here. So obviously, United States, along with its allies in the West, and also Taiwan, and also China, right? But interestingly, these three different actors, roughly, they have somewhat different takes. And of course, it's probably easier to interpret US and its allies' position on this. I mean, basically, the desirable goal, of course, is to maintain the status quo, and nothing needs to be changed. But for the other two actors, China and Taiwan, I mean, there are some debates and some ambiguities here. So for Xi Jinping, I think for China, it's an aspiring revisionist. I mean, this is probably the also very important question for a lot of IR scholars, especially. So whether Xi Jinping is a revisionist or if Lai is a revisionist, and people have doubts about them. And maybe there's less doubt about China because Xi Jinping, in a sense, I mean, even though we could argue that the extent to which China, for whatever things that China has done right now, ever has the effect of changing the status quo or the international order. But I guess they never hide their intention to do that. It's just the question is whether they can or not. But for Taiwan, especially from the President Lai's inauguration speech a few days ago, well, there is obviously lots of emphasis on how Taiwan wants to maintain the status quo. And of course, he also elaborated on how the means through which Taiwan can achieve that. But of course, there are also doubts about his intention, given his previous remarks about himself being a pragmatic proponent for Taiwan independence. And of course, obviously, he wants to play down that people's expectation about that, but people have doubts. So in other words, I mean, this kind of trilateral relationship here is a key to our answer about, to our question about whether the status quo will be moved in the future or not. And I'm going to offer you, I guess, first of all, according to this framework, a couple of different parameters according to which we can actually make our own assessments. So after President Li's speech, of course, as you can see from China, as it has been mentioned by John, that there's now actually, as we are gathering here, there are military drills surrounding Taiwan to punish, in a sense, Taiwan's, especially President Li's speech. I guess, to hone the skills for potential blockade in the future, as Dr. Li also just mentioned. And also, People's Daily, there has been, I think, 2 days, consecutive days, they published articles lampooning President Li's inauguration speech, even though not on the first page, but it's pretty prominent enough. So this is what Xi Jinping or China has been doing since the inauguration. And on the Taiwan side, I think, well, as I said in the speech, President Lai has emphasized quite a few times the importance of maintaining the status quo. But of course, I also want to share with you, there are obviously some differences in personal styles as opposed to President Taiwan. And it's somehow, I want to make an analogy, even though you can correct me if you have a different opinion. So somehow, as I watch Lai, the president who just delivered that speech, I had this feeling that it sort of reminded me of Bush Jr., who actually used to openly admit the lack of nuance himself. So it's not like President Lai is not well educated or is not sophisticated in political languages, but I mean, he's the first president who actually has no educational background in social sciences. Even though he's an undergrad, his major was public health, but he tends to describe himself as a doctor, maybe because the title has a higher social prestige in Taiwanese society. But the thing is, compared to his predecessors, since President Lee Teng-hui, who is an agricultural economist and also, I suppose, has read a lot of philosophy books, and we have 3 lawyers in a row as a president. So I think when I read the speech, I had a sense that he himself might be wondering or scratch his own head, wondering all these legal terms or political languages that people use to describe the cross relationship. And therefore, even though, as I said, the tone basically still is pretty friendly, and he indeed delivered quite a few messages across the Taiwan Strait to show his wish to stabilize the current situation. But also, he was actually much more blunt about a lot of many things. I won't go to the detail. You could just take a look at the speech itself. But the thing is, personal style, obviously, as I said, is kind of like a little bit lack of nuance and maybe less patient. And it seems that he wanted to say something in a much more straightforward fashion to his people, wanted to deliver the message in a much more straightforward fashion. So that might, of course, also bring some new dynamics into this trilateral relationship. But the thing is, international politics is, of course, people have agencies, but also structures are important. So I guess for the remaining minutes, I'm going to just share with you some important parameters, as I mentioned, and they might have very important influence on the development of the situation in the future. So, of course, we have seen the exchanges of remarks, very intensifying remarks, and sometimes hawkish remarks across the Taiwan Strait, and also the actual actions Beijing is now taking against Taiwan. But I think there are some limitations to Beijing, at least in the short run. Of course, it's hard to predict something in the long run, but at least in the short run, we can have some assessments. So first of all, I was fortunate to be invited to talk also by the senator just right after the election earlier this year. And I think my view until today hasn't been changed much. And the thing is, first of all, even though we can debate about how bad the Chinese economy is right now, or if it is really bad. But the thing is, I guess there's no denying that the current administration in Beijing, they're working very hard to restore people's confidence, either domestic investors or foreign investors to come back to China to invest. And therefore, I think, given that mindset, unless you want to argue that China doesn't care about its economy, otherwise, to restore the investments and people's confidence in China's economy, it's actually not in Beijing's interest to escalate the situation too much. But the thing is, I think Beijing is trying to strike a fine balance between, of course, they have their own local domestic constituencies to account for, and therefore, they have to say something and do something. But on the other hand, this fine balance has to be stricken between this punishment and the future prospect for the economy, right? So that's why I don't think, at least in the short run, Beijing is going to do anything that is out of hand. And especially, as you probably also know, just in a few days, there's going to be a summit, right, among South Korean, Japanese, and Chinese leaders. And I know Premier Li Qiang is also going to Seoul to attend that summit. And therefore, at least for this month, I guess that's why the drill only lasts for 2 days. I think it's going to end tomorrow. So the actions have to be taken, but also the measures are more moderate. And I think the goal is, if they care about the economy, they cannot treat Taiwan too harsh from a military perspective, because that doesn't just hurt Taiwan, but also hurt China. If people have the perception that the war is coming, then why would anyone want to go to China to invest? So that's kind of the economic constraints China is facing now. And the second is about domestic politics in Taiwan. And I think Dr. Li also mentioned that a little bit. Even though DPP, again, now is in power, but President Lai won the election with a smaller margin by just 40%, as opposed to the remaining 60% that actually didn't vote for him. And therefore, I think from Beijing's perspective, I think that's also one of the responses I had back to January, that, well, essentially, Beijing can still claim victory on this, right? So even though Lai won again, or DPP won again, but actually there are lots of people who didn't want to see DPP in power again. And therefore, there is some improvement, and they can still have some hope in the future that KMT or other pro-Beijing parties come back to power and then do something to change the political landscape in Taiwan. So in that sense, it deserves just maybe 1 minute of delving into the Taiwanese politics. As some of you might know, just a few days ago, or it's actually ongoing right now, there have been some protests right outside Taiwan's Congress. And the reason is KMT, the major party in the opposition, and also TPP, Taiwan People's Party, another emerging party who enjoy 8 seats from their PR list. So they together proposed what they call a congressional reform bill and inside the bill, they proposed to pass something like contempt, or they're going to punish people, especially the officials who contempt for Congress, and also they want to expand the jurisdiction of the Congress to have investigation power, so as opposed to the judiciary investigation. So these are obviously measures that could actually undermine the executive policies. Even though, again, we can debate whether this is still democracy, but the thing is, from the DPP side, this is actually just their endeavor to clench more power, because now they enjoy the majority, and DPP lost the majority. So in the future, I guess the angle we can take, and especially from Beijing's perspective, is that the extent to which these opposition parties can have some chance to win elections in the future, and especially there's going to be a 2026 election, the midterm election in Taiwan, and most of the mayors and also local congressmen and congresswomen, these seats are going to be open for re-election. And so I think not just for the two parties, but also for Beijing. I mean, they are watching the development in Taiwan and see if these parties can get more power and more seats, and therefore can get more influence over Taiwan, and therefore, they can undermine the current administration's endeavors to enhance Taiwanese military capacity or self-defense or other progress. So that's, I guess, the second thing. The second factor that might also make Beijing a little bit hesitant to do things out of hand. And third, US elections coming in November, right? So this American factor, of course, also plays a role here. So I don't think, at least until the end of this year, Beijing wants to rock the boat entirely, because even though, of course, it's hard to predict whether it's Trump or Biden, but the thing is, if China does anything that is overly hawkish to Taiwan, then obviously that's going to play, that's going to influence the American election as well. And I don't think Beijing has interest to overcomplicate that, which is make American elections even more unpredictable. And then another thing that I can say, since I don't think I have too much time left. So for Xi Jinping himself, there's also an angle about whether Xi Jinping would be in a rush to do anything. And I think, according to a recent study I did with my colleagues, Victor Shi, on the POA reforms, it seems that, well, of course, there are lots of studies on this, right, in terms of how much power Xi Jinping has gathered in his own hands, and also how successful he was. According to that study, it seems that in terms of promotion patterns before and after the 2016 reform, obviously, even inside POA, I'm not talking about the civilians, I'm talking about POA, those generals. It seems that Xi Jinping's promotion strategy has been changed. So previously, I think maybe the power hasn't been fully concentrated, and therefore, he still had to make some compromises by promoting, generals from other factions. So kind of like more to remain that balance of power inside the party. But after 2016, it seems that he almost just promoted people of his own. And so according to that evidence and also other pieces of evidence provided by other studies, it seems that his power has been pretty consolidated inside the party. And therefore, using Taiwan as a way to gain more influence in the party and also to justify his monopoly over power in the party seems to be unnecessary. So in other words, according to these studies and according to my own, it seems that he is not in a rush to do anything overly aggressive. So, and of course, I'm not saying China or Xi Jinping is not going to do anything in this gray zone area, just to continue to harass Taiwan. I think he's going to do that again and again, just to keep Taiwan in a tight leash. But my assessment, I guess, is, and I'm of course open to comment or feedback on this as well. So in terms of whether they are going to do anything that is overly aggressive and then just rocking the boat and make everyone surprised, I don't think that's going to happen. And according to the kind of 4 different dimensions or parameters I just offered, they would do something for sure, but probably going to do this in a more moderate fashion. So I guess I might just stop here and then welcome your comments.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of optimism that we're not facing an imminent conflict and reminding us that China's economic interests, its ability to understand the domestic political dynamics, may be a source of caution on the part of Beijing. I think that's really important. Let's move on swiftly, because I know we've got lots of areas to cover, to Seong-Ho, who's going to give us the view from Seoul.
Yes, thank you so much, John. And it's my great pleasure to be here at Cambridge. Maybe some 30 years, that was my first visit in 90s. Anyway, it's good to be here, especially with John, my good friend. And let me talk a few things about Korean Peninsula in general and its implication in the region. First of all, the thing is, from the 90s, we'll always talk about if there's any war, it will be a Korean Peninsula. With North Korean nuclear weapon development in the early 90s, President Clinton doing a surgical strike, and then followed by Bush 2000 early, and then preemptive strike. And then 2017, President Trump was talking about, the broad nose. So we Koreans are always living with this, worry and deep concern about when there is going to be a second Korean War. Luckily and thankfully, it hasn't happened yet. And in general, more broadly speaking, since the end of Cold War, if there was any major conflict, most people thought it would be East Asia, Korea, but also Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, until recently. And again, luckily and thankfully, we haven't had that kind of situation yet. Instead, we have a war in Ukraine and war in Israel and Hamas in the Middle East. So that is a kind of a general kind of background that I'm going to talk about. The three things. The first, obviously, North Korea situation and Kim Jong-un. And here is, again, another pessimism. Then early this year, Kim Jong-un came out with his New Year's speech saying that the two Koreas, first of all, South Korea is the complete enemy of North Korean state. And second of all, as a result, the two Koreas is at the actual stage of war, meaning that there could be a war at any time. And the third, in the more long-term, more surprising statement, he said that North Korea is giving up national unification as a national mandate. They are not seeking for unification anymore. It's a kind of similar in, across the strait. Both China and Taiwan, there has been always saying that we are the one China and one day we will be reunited. In Korea too, since the division of two Koreas, the both Korea on our constitution in both countries, officially, of course, the meaning is quite opposite between each of us. We are going to unify under our terms. But it has been always, for both North Korea and South Koreans, has been our national mandate or dream that and someday we have to reunify. And of course, South Korea still keeps that card in the constitutional, place. But North Korea is saying that, no, not anymore. So what does it mean? Instead, he's saying that we are actually at the stage of war. After years of developing all kinds of, shooting missile and etc. So many people worried about early this year that, wow, maybe Kim Jong-un is really serious about taking some kind of action. And especially when we have this conservative government, who is also quite, took a different approach in terms of inter-Korean relations, departing from previous progressive government, emphasizing engagement rather than this current government emphasizing we are going to deal with it from position of strength, the US-ROK alliance, etc. So the two Koreas, the situation is quite tense. There's a lot of bad words going on between each other. But somehow, luckily, we haven't had any major military crisis on the Korean peninsula yet, so far. We are still keep watching. There could be any, even this year. Things happen, it will not be a surprise. But that's hanging on the very delicate balance at the moment. The second thing is U.S. ROK alliance has been the good year between Korea and U.S. It has been like that always in the recent years. As Korea becomes more and more important partner for the United States, both economically and also militarily. Economically, as like Taiwan, Korea is one of the key suppliers of semiconductor and all the major, product and supply chain and friendshoring and all those things. South Korea is becoming important. Even militarily, South Korea has become number 5, they called, military power in the world. We're producing all kinds of weapon systems, especially among the democratic country in the world. There are not many countries who can produce that kind of weapon in such a short amount of time and provide those systems when there is a demand. In fact, that has been the case in the aftermath of Ukraine war. Lots of European countries, especially East Asia, Poland and Czechoslovakia, wants to rebuild their military and they want to purchase some weapon. There are not many suppliers, including United States or Japan. So South Korea is playing a very important role these days. And with this current, conservative government, President Yoon Suk-yeol, who is emphasizing the alliance so much, and even go beyond that, he also another policy has been the restoring Korea-US-Japan relation, which has been always the United States one of the big agenda in East Asia. So as a result, we had this trilateral summit at Camp David last year between the Prime Minister Kishida and Yoon Suk-yeol and Biden. So in general, the status of alliance is quite strong at the moment. But the one big question hanging on the loom is US election. And what if Trump wins? What will happen? So there is lots of speculation, but obviously it doesn't bode very well. If indeed he wins, lots of people will talk about, there will be a very serious kind of tension in the alliance over this military burden sharing, but also more troubling sign is that the US general policy, alliance policy, it's not only, it's one thing that Trump saying that, oh, you have to pay, but it is also another these days when we look at the statement coming out of his key security advisor or commentator saying that, oh, by the way, from now on, South Korea has to take your own independent role in defending yourself. That also include maybe South Korea can develop its own nuclear weapon, because we are not going to care that much about North Korea denuclearization, etc. There has been some recent interview by one of the key aides to Trump with the South Korean media who was saying that, oh, South Korea going for nuclear is not necessarily a bad thing. It could be like the British or French nuclear weapon against Soviet Union during the Cold War, in the context of a new Cold War coming out between China and United States. That was a quite surprising statement for me. So we will see how it goes, but still we have a very big question hanging over our head in this coming US election over alliance in US-Korea, but in alliance in general in East Asia. The third point is that within this context, yes, lots of people talk about the Cold War II between US and China, but also there has been Cold War over the Korean Peninsula between US-Korea-Japan trilateral partners versus the Russia-China North Korea trilateral partnership, because things was happening without that much kind of talk going on in between those countries. There has been Ukraine war, and there has been Putin and Kim Jong-un meeting last year. There was a Putin and Xi Jinping meeting this May, as opposed to, as I said, US-Korea-Japan trilateral meeting and bilateral meeting between US-Korea and US-Japan. So it seems like there is a kind of a second Cold War, shaping around the Korean Peninsula in between those two camps, axis of whatever, the authoritarian state and axis of democratic state. But at the moment, things are not that simple in a way, as already alluded by John and to the gentlemen. Just yesterday, there was an announcement by the Korean presidential office that tomorrow there will be a trilateral summit between China and Japan and Korea. I mean, it's remarkable. It's going to happen tomorrow, but the official statement came out yesterday. The trilateral meeting between those three summits, which is happening in 4.5 years. So you see the context of which these trilateral dynamics have shaping. There has lots of juggling going on between Korea, Japan, and China, but that somehow they decide to have a meeting at this moment. And obviously, the big move, I think, came from China part. By the way, Xi Jinping is not coming. Li Chang is the representative of all this trilateral summit. Anyway, one of the key driver was, I think, the Chinese concern, as Professor Tung talked about, the economic interest of reviving its own economy. In doing so, China needs the partner, and especially Korea and Japan, as a key supplier of key sensitive tech items, etc. But they're also key investor in Chinese market. And there's a kind of recalibration going on in Beijing about this past attitude towards Seoul and Japan with over very aggressive or coercive approach. So maybe this is a new charm offensive coming out of Beijing towards this Tokyo and Seoul. But anyway, there's a new dynamics going on between those three countries and the leaders. And finally, I think the big question still, all in all these three, is that this the most immediate question is who is going to be the next president of the United States? Because it will impact upon every aspect of not only regional dynamics, but also bilateral dynamics, but not only in economics, but also geopolitical and alliance politics as well. And yet at the same time, maybe because of that, some uncertainty in US domestic politics, it is more and more important to look at carefully what is happening in domestic politics of all these East Asian countries like Taiwan, over cross-strait issues. It is more about what Taiwanese think about the cross-strait relation. It will be more about how the two Koreas, North and South Korea, manage our relationship. It will be more about how the Japanese and Chinese will talk about the East China Sea territorial dispute. Because, sorry, we cannot, at the end of the day, trust the United States anymore as we used to do. Maybe I'm using too much language, at least for the time being. We have to manage our situation. Otherwise, the margin of error for us is getting smaller and smaller to stay out of big trouble. So let me conclude with that as, so Winston Churchill has once said, Jaja is always better than war. So I hope this wisdom still goes and stay alive in East Asia. Thank you so much.
Again, I think it's, is this on? Yes. It's striking how a country like Korea has demonstrated both now with the convening of this trilateral meeting in Seoul, but also under the last administration. Small powers or middle powers can have a catalyzing role in response to these graver security challenges. And if we want to take an optimistic view of the prospect of a Trump presidency, it's encouraging so many countries in the region to start thinking about new forms of cooperation, quite independent of the question of how much is enough in terms of defense expenditure. And as I think you pointed out really importantly, consistent with the way the United States under the Biden administration is thinking about increasing variation in the way states cooperate. This idea of a lattice work of different forms of cooperation between states. Korea seems very well suited to that role because of its industrial capacity, particularly in terms of defense technology. And also, perhaps another point for us to consider where Korea is concerned, a state that sees its influence increasingly in global terms, not just regional. Also true, of course, of Japan, which we haven't said much about at this stage, but again, we might come back to. Last but not least, Astrid, and then we'll have some interaction and open up for the floor.
Thank you, and I'd like to say thank you as well for the kind invitation to have me here. Bill's made a really brave effort to invite me, I think, every year since this started, and every year until now I've had to cancel often in the last minute, so I'm super grateful that you've not given up on me, and I'm here for the first time, finally, to have this wonderful conversation. And I'm here, I suspect, as an expert primarily on China's role in the world, mainland China's role in the world, and also as somebody who looks at that from my office a stone's throw from Westminster. So I'm going to try to speak to you a bit from that position that I hold. And UK's Indo-Pacific tilt was always very anxious about China. I think we can see that from the integrated review refresh of 2023, perhaps even more than previously. That, as you will be very aware, portrays China as an epoch-defining and systemic challenge to the UK. And at this juncture, there's a great concern about authoritarian China's aspirations to hegemony in the neighborhood, pursued through heavy investment in military modernization, in dual-use technologies, and not least these kind of grey zone activities that we've also heard about on the panel today. Of course, there's an explicitly anti-Western rhetoric here that's combined with displays of unity with Russia and to an extent North Korea during time of war, of course, in Ukraine. So yesterday, the Secretary of State for Defence, Grant Shapps, said at the London Defence Conference that Russia and China, he is certain, are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine. So at this shaky time of imminent election in the UK, this all seems pretty scary stuff, right? Perhaps even the kind of stuff whose scariness it's tempting to evoke and deploy for short-term political purposes in the run-up to that kind of election. And of course, UK politicians are not the only ones dealing with this kind of situation. Many in the Indo-Pacific, as we've heard, are anxiously anticipating the American election later this year and the real prospect that we might see another era of Trump and the uncertainty that is anticipated to bring to the region. So in this context of real and rhetorically encouraged anxiety, I want to invite colleagues here to help me and us collectively think through what I think is a real challenge in this context, and that's what it might mean to engage our anxieties about China with an emphasis on cognitive empathy with China. So cognitive empathy, as I use it, involves an understanding of another party's perspective, emotions, and thought processes without necessarily agreeing with them, right? So I want to, in anticipation of comments, emphasize again the fact that we might understand and empathize with somebody does not mean we necessarily agree with them. So for the UK to have cognitive empathy with China in the Indo-Pacific context means recognizing and understanding Chinese motivations, concerns, and strategic goals while it's formulating its own policies and strategies in the region. So when I hear expressions of various kinds of emotions in China, and I think some of them might be emotions like entitlement in relation to Taiwan, for example, but one, I hear expressions of anxiety in the UK about how vulnerable we are to Chinese actions in and beyond the Indo-Pacific, how supply chains can be interrupted, our economic security undermined, our military defenses sabotaged, and our values and standards countered. And also, I think how our influence in international fora might be maliciously resisted. I'm really struck by the extent to which those anxieties are mirrored in China. So saying that they started it and we are simply responding or reacting, I think isn't really helpful way to negotiate anxious actors here. So China might feel anxious about the UK's policies in the Indo-Pacific for several reasons, reflecting, I think, broader geopolitical, economic, and security concerns. I'm going to put a number of factors on the table here without dwelling for too long on them, being conscious of time. So first of all, I think there's a lot of anxiety in China about our strategic alliances and our military presence in the region. So that includes AUKUS, it includes the Quad, UK's involvement in AUKUS, security pact with Australia and the US, as well as its increasing engagement with the Quad, so US, Japan, India, Australia, is seen as a counterbalance, and I think this is a correct perception, right, to China's influence in the region. And these alliances are designed to enhance military cooperation, including the sharing of advanced defense technologies, which many in China perceive as a very direct threat to its strategic interests. And this is met with great emotional anxiety and displays of that anxiety. We've also got freedom of navigation operations, right? So the UK's commitment to maintaining what we refer to as the freedom of navigation in contested waters like the South China Sea, often through naval deployments, challenges China's territorial claims and military activities in those areas. So this first area of anxiety in China. I think a second area worth talking about is anxiety about economic competition, which resonates and mirrors, I think, very strongly with anxieties here in the UK. So first of all, we've got trade and investment policies. The UK's efforts to establish and strengthen agreements with key Indo-Pacific nations are seen as an attempt to reduce the region's economic dependence on China. And of course, there's an anxiety about that lack of dependence coming from China. So initiatives like joining the CPTPP are part of this anxiety-provoking strategy. There's also criticism in this area of BRI projects, right? That's been quite vocal. So the UK's fairly cautious stance on China's Belt and Road Initiative projects, which involves these significant infrastructure investments in the Indo-Pacific, reflects a concern over debt sustainability and most of all about political influence. So by promoting alternative investments, the UK, I think, is indirectly competing with China's economic initiatives in the region. And of course, as we are concerned about our economic growth, our ability to deliver wealth to our people, a good life, there are similar concerns in China, even though, of course, they work through a system quite differently there. Of course, there's anxiety also about diplomatic and ideological differences that we are all very familiar with, and the promotion of democratic values, I think, is a real concern here. The UK's emphasis on promoting democratic values, rule of law, human rights, which we'll hear more about in panels here today, I think, in the foreign policy of the UK, of course, contrasts very sharply with Chinese governance model. And this ideological difference, I think, really fuels Chinese anxiety about Western efforts to contain its rise, to promote an alternative governance model in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, I'll mention support for regional institutions and the anxiety that that might bring. So the UK's support for regional institutions like ASEAN, which advocate for this kind of rules-based order and conflict resolution, is viewed by China as a strategy, I think, to rally regional countries against its assertive policies in the region. So I'll chuck those issues out for discussion throughout the day and encourage us all to collectively think about what this cognitive empathy might look like in the relationships that we examine, particularly perhaps in relation to a mainland China that causes a lot of anxiety in our own quarters. So overall, I think China's anxiety about the UK's policies in the Indo-Pacific, of course, stems from the perception that these policies are part of a broader effort to counterbalance China and its growing influence and assertiveness in the region. And the anxious reaction to that is grounded purposefully, politically, and rhetorically in a deep-rooted history of understanding UK and other powers as banding together to bully, to contain, and keep China down to the detriment of the Chinese people. So a lot of emotional baggage going on there and anxieties that I think many of us can see direct correlations with at home. I'll stop there to open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. And that really, I think, nicely brings together a lot of questions I have to all of you, highlighting this question of how big the gap of understanding is. I mean, cognitive empathy, I think, I might suggest is in short supply because of the way in which domestic politics has played out, not only the international dimension. And of course, it's not necessarily something radically new. I think of Robert McNamara's reflections on the US experience in Indochina. Ironically, in a way, given his role in supporting the application of technical force in a way that seemed to suggest a complete lack of empathy. But in his memoirs and in his reflections, McNamara, of course, stressed the importance of seeing things from the vantage point of your opponent. Elites are perhaps quite good at reflecting on that. Historians are quite good. But in the current context, do you think that there's much scope to persuade public opinion, whether in Europe or in East Asia, to begin to think in this way? Is there an audience that's going to be receptive to this? That's a question to you, but I'd also like to extend the same question to Seong-Ho in thinking about Korea. We've just seen an election for the National Assembly in which the leader of the opposition party, Lee Jae-myung, said very aggressively two things I thought which were interesting. One, we don't care about Taiwan. It doesn't matter to us. We shouldn't be involved. Is that evidence of a retreat into a kind of little Korea mentality on the part of a party that now has a really commanding position in the National Assembly? The same leader, of course, in that election campaign was very quick to criticize President Yoon for his closeness with Japan, using some of these old historical grievances, talking about betrayal, presenting Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon as essentially selling out Korean public opinion. So could you reflect on that, perhaps? And then with the same theme to our two colleagues from Taiwan, it's interesting to think about a kind of diversification of cooperation. Mr. Motegi, the Secretary General of the Liberal Democratic Party, has just said in the last day or so that Japan will increase its engagement with Taiwan and enhance cooperation. What is it about that bilateral relationship that allows this new pragmatic cooperation to take place? How far can that go? And what will be the reception on the part of Taiwanese public opinion in thinking about how best to adjust to that real risk, the question we keep coming back to, of a possible Trump presidency? Is the existential risk of America disengaging, if we can make that assumption, going to force public opinion in the region, and particularly in Taiwan, to think about new forms of cooperation with countries that it's had long and complicated historical relationships with? So if we can sort of open up that space, and then we'll open up to the floor, I think. Astrid, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you. Really excellent question, and I'm delighted to hear about your optimism that this is a capacity and attitude that's alive and kicking in our elites. I'm a little bit less optimistic about that, but I will be delighted to be wrong on that note. I think when it comes to public cognitive empathy, it's absolutely something that has to be fostered and cultivated, right? We have all sorts of forces and dynamics that go far beyond our discussions of the Indo-Pacific that pull in the opposite direction, right? And that is bound up with how social media works, the kind of power we give to corporations and profit-making ventures in that process. It has to do with how traditional media functions. I was reading yesterday about polarization in public discussion, and it struck me the extent to which the US, because of how the political system works there, how the media system works there, is much more far gone than the UK, and how the UK has been able in many ways to perhaps resist that extreme level of polarization in public debate, partly because of wonderful institutions like the BBC, right? So I think that the kind of cognitive empathy does not simply emerge by itself, not necessarily, and I don't think it can be fostered in isolation from addressing those much wider problems in society, to which I, of course, don't have the immediate solution. So in our center, the Lao China Institute, we have an ongoing debate about this and about our responsibility in this regard, right? How do we engage publics, media, policymakers, in ways that improves that public debate? And I think a problem, again, perhaps a bigger problem in the US than in the UK, has been coming from a lot of political elites. The demonization of China expertise, right? The real risk that some people are put at by virtue of speaking about China, or simply being Chinese, right? Being from ethnic minority populations from within China puts you at other kinds of risks, right? So many scholars, particularly who come from China, are doubly damned, right, by having to feel the pressures from an authoritarian state, but also then being made suspicious in countries like the US and to a lesser extent perhaps here in the UK as well. So I think that there are perhaps collective discussions that we could be better at amongst people like the ones gathered in this room about how we can improve public conversation and engage publics in exercises of cognitive empathy as opposed to scoring simple points. And we will see how the run-up to this election in the UK pans out. We've already heard from Rishi Sunak some suggestions that there might be sable rattling and fear-mongering going on in that campaign. How do we deal with that? How do we resist it? Or how do we preserve an element of cognitive empathy in that context, I think is a real challenge, which is why I'm presenting it as such to this room, because I at least have not got the solutions, but I'm acutely aware that it's something we need to collectively get better at and find our own roles in.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, Seong-Ho.
Yes. Speaking of cognitive empathy, before we talk about China, I think we also need that cognitive empathy between two Koreas, especially from South Korea. I mean, one thing I talked about this session first, the North Korea declaring all kinds of very aggressive statement early this year. Lots of people, of course, the media portrayed it, Kim Jong-un is going crazy, he's going to start a war, he's going to use nuclear weapon against South Koreans, etc. But on the other hand, some experts or others like me point out that maybe this is Kim Jong-un saying that please, leave us alone. And this is the expression North Korea being more and more kind of feel like marginalized, or they're being weakened in terms of competition between two Korea economically and militarily. So that's one area that South Korea and North Korea need to work on in the coming years to keep the stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And going back to your question about Lee Jae-myung's position on Taiwan and Japan, I think first on Taiwan issue, he's becoming more, he's playing more realistic and pragmatic approach rather than, it's not like I don't care about Taiwan, Why? Because it was under the President Moon Jae-in, his predecessor, the Progressive Party president, saying that for the first time in U.S.-Korea bilateral summit, that Korea made a statement on the Taiwan issue, that we want to see the peaceful and resolution of Taiwan, which in itself provoked some kind of Chinese anger and criticism. And in that context, Lee Jae-myung thinks that is good enough for us to Korea voice certain concern about this regional issue. But he tends to think that the current government goes unnecessarily much more aggressive and provocative on that issue in a sense that it only worsens the situation. In a way, it provokes more of a Chinese anxiety over this, when even South Korea tried to be on the boat. And second of all, I always tend to say, when it comes to Koreans' role on Taiwan crisis, first of all, as my Taiwan colleague said, Taiwan people doesn't want to see any trouble or war on the cross state. And it's just too much kind of go into the hypothetical situation as if there's a war between US and China, which in itself is such a crazy idea. We don't want to get there, first of all. We want to prevent that kind of situation from happening. So to do so, what should we do? What kind of rhetoric and language we use? We have to be very careful about, and that goes into this, what you just said about cognitive empathy toward China. Third, Japan front. Yes, Korea-Japan relations always is quite complex. But this is more about domestic politics playing out between Yi and the Yoon, conservative and progressive. And it goes into history issue and all those, the war, comfort woman, the Japanese has been kind of still very much, very not so up for coming on that issue, even though Yoon gave so much concession to all front. So that the South Korean public is not quite happy about it. And Lee was addressing that and trying to use that kind of sentiment against this current government. But finally, in general, Korea-Japan relation, especially at the public level, is getting fundamentally much more into the positive term, as the people-to-people exchange between the two societies. We are the most tourists going into Japan versus Japanese tourists coming to South Korea. For obvious, there's an economic region and many other things. But the bottom line is Japan is becoming more and more equals in terms of our economic and political and social condition. So we begin to see between each other more and eye to eye as the same kind of equal partners. So that creates a kind of basic condition for Korea-Japan becoming very good neighbors in the coming years and decade at the moment. Thank you.
So Hans, you mentioned the background of President Lai, public health doctor. If we stretch our definition of security to think about less conventional forms of insecurity, global health, pandemics, I mean, is this a context in which the sort of public empathy or cognitive empathy that Astrid was talking about might work in the Taiwanese-China connection?
Well, the thing is, for example, I mean, there are occasions where I guess China might want to offer some help, especially previously during the Taiwanese earthquake in early April. But even though President Lai hasn't been sworn in back then, but the previous administration actually decided not to take that. So I mean, I'm not sure about that's going to work. I mean, since there has to be some political foundation upon which that kind of goodwill can be built. But I do, well, in a sense, I mean, the question about, your question about the public opinions in Taiwan, and also regarding, I think, Astrid's comments on this anxiety, I think I do have something to share, and especially I didn't have the time to talk about this during my first presentation. So the thing is, I think all these East Asian neighbors, they are very carefully navigating this relationship, right? So on the one hand, for example, like what you mentioned, the Japanese national defense minister just openly said maybe there should be some cooperation between Taiwan and Japan. But on the other hand, if you look at, for example, the delegation from Japan to the President Lai's inauguration ceremony, there wasn't actually a very high-profile delegation. The reason is they're going to have, as someone just said, tomorrow there's going to be a summit, and therefore they also have their concerns. So I think either for even the South Korea seems to be a little bit more, detached or try to distance from this potential controversy, but either South Korea or Japan, they're taking this issue very carefully, and therefore, first of all, I don't think policy-wise you're going to see very radical shift. You could have kind of like piecemeal progression towards the goal of making the strait much more stabilized, but I don't think there's going to be very, huge step towards that, especially too aggressive step towards that. But on the other hand, those developments also have impacts on Taiwanese public.
The mic isn't working.
Oh, okay. Well, the thing is, I guess, a lot of colleagues of mine have been doing a lot of survey research, and also including myself. And I think Taiwanese public, in terms of their opinion, is pretty divided. And I mentioned this kind of divide at several occasions. So it's a little bit like the debate between realists and liberals. So on the one hand, you have the current administration, they tend to have more realist mindset in the sense that, to protect Taiwan. Well, that's actually in President Lai's speech that, if you want to defend Taiwan, make Taiwan safer, well, it's important to enhance the military capacity because that's a way to go. And dialogue or conversations, they don't actually help us. But on the other hand, you also have liberals, and interestingly, those politicians from KMT, they tend to believe we should have more dialogue, commercial exchanges, trade, investments, and that kind of economic ties are actually the cornerstone for bringing peace to the region. And therefore, these are two very different approaches. And this difference in approaches also reflects in people's opinion. And so sometimes it's actually pretty frustrating. So whatever kind of message you want to deliver, either from Japan, from the United States, in terms of intensifying or strengthening the cooperation, but that's not necessarily how people read the messages. So on the one hand, from those more pro, liberalism audience, they have sometimes very deep-seated skepticism against the U.S. or Japan because they think, well, in the end, you're not going to come to help, once there's a war happening. And eventually it depends on us. And therefore, we need to have a more conciliatory approach to China. So that's kind of one thinking. And on the other side of the aisle, those who have a more realist mindset, they're not going to, accept this kind of viewpoint. And they believe, we need more weapons. We need more military help. And therefore, to strengthen the tie with the U.S. or to marshal the support from all these democratic allies, these are the real keys for our safety. And in terms of the public opinion, I did 2 surveys just right after the presidential election earlier this year. And I found, well, on the losing side, their anxiety just went up dramatically in terms of they might think, well, China might attack tomorrow because now, electing the one election. So, and recently, I suppose I'm actually trying to do that now. If you survey the people on the other side, the green side, in Taiwanese politics, they're going to be very anxious because, KMT enjoy the majority in the Congress, and they're using that majority to undermine the effectiveness of current administration's governance. So I think this is, well, just to make it short, so that the thing is, it's very divided in Taiwan's public opinion. And so sometimes it's hard to, the efforts sometimes they are just diluted because of this divisiveness.
Che-Chuan, would you like to add some thoughts on the question of domestic sentiment or the broader question of cooperation with other countries? And then we'll very briefly go to the floor.
Okay. I pretty much agree with Professor Tung just said. It is, I think it is a fact that the social division or kind of internal conflict within Taiwanese society is getting worse just to some extent. I still remember that in late 1990s, when we were about to vote for Taipei City mayors, those people standing with blue camp and were greeting each other with those from on the blue camp. So at that time, I think people in Taiwan tend to agree with probably we can collaborate together, even though we have different idea about the final resolution of the cross-strait disputes. But it is not anymore the case. So that is an issue that we have to take into serious concern, not only for President Lai, but also for China, if they like to continue their so-called political warfare against Taiwan, or three warfares against Taiwan, continuing to divide the social consolidation in Taiwan may be kind of a good idea for themselves, so that they can undermine people's trust on the government or people's confidence on Taiwan's democracy. And John mentioned about Japan. They do talk a lot. And not only the former, already passed away, Japan's Prime Minister said that if Taiwan has contingency, Japan has contingency. And there are many more Japanese politicians and high-ranking generals say that if Taiwan fall into the hands, the control of the authoritarian China, Japan may become the next target of Chinese military expansion in First Island chain and much more beyond. But I would say that Japanese, they are always very cautious. There are some positive progress. For instance, it's already revealed by media that Japan, for the first time, dispatched a civilian officer from their defense minister last year to Taipei. We never see that before. But that is, we can just say that that is a very, very cautious small step. And we have wargaming discussion with Japan's high-ranking retired generals, and maybe people are probing about what Japan and Taiwan can collaborate together. But so far, I would say that if Taiwan do have some military conflict with mainland China, probably Japan will play mostly as a role of providing logistic support to the United States military in this region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With Bill's permission, we don't have time to go on? Okay, in that case, much as I would like to take questions from the floor, I'm going to have to apologize that we've had a very, I think, interesting and revealing and illuminating discussion. We won't be able to take questions, unfortunately, but I do think it set the scene very helpfully for the discussion that will follow later today and tomorrow. I want to thank the panelists for their insights, both the pessimistic and the optimistic observations. My takeaway from this is that we can't ignore domestic opinion. It's a critical factor in shaping the rhetorical pronouncements of individual leaders. And it's a source of great uncertainty or anxiety, as was pointed out, I think, so persuasively. But let's break for coffee, and thank you. And I ask the audience to thank our speakers for what's been a very illuminating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.